And
Okay.
I just briefly wanted, on behalf of the center, wanted to welcome Venerable Michael to the center. It's his first time teaching for us. I hope just the first of many times over many years teaching for us. So he'll be teaching this Sunday morning class in February until the end of February on training the mind. Venerable Michael has been a monk since he was a child, which is raised in Kopan. So he's really steeped in the Buddhist teachings and tradition, and right now is the resident teacher of Yeshe Norbu in Sweden. So it's wonderful that he's able to join us, and we're really grateful that he accepted our invitation. And like I said,
Thank
I
you.
hope it's just the first of many, many teachings to come. So thank you very much, Venerable.
Sure. I'm just trying to adjust my iPad so that you see more of me. Okay, well, maybe that's a little better. Okay. So can everyone hear me? Sound clear? Okay, wonderful. As some of you might be already aware, we do usually begin with some prayers in a traditional way, but the purpose of the prayers really is to mainly to remind us to set our mind, set our mind to the teaching. So I think for this evening, let us begin with just a short meditation where we're just a very simple, basic meditation of bringing our mind into more focused and clarity. So we can do that by taking a few moments to just be aware of our immediate surrounding, the space. I'm sure we've all chosen to have a little bit of a relatively quiet space. So that in itself is a conducive space for meditation or teaching. So we'll just be aware of this immediate surrounding. And then gradually we can bring awareness to our physical presence. We might be sitting on a cushion on the floor, or we might be sitting on a chair, sofa, wherever we may be sitting, just feeling the presence of oneself on the spot where one is. And this awareness of our physical presence in itself can be also, we can take this opportunity to just really begin to feel some gratitude and appreciation that we have this, just being aware of our physical presence means that we are aware of our life, our precious human life. It's amazing that we have this incredible good condition called a human life, where I have an intelligent brain, where our mind is primary source of being aware of things, being able to analyze, to think, to decide. So just really feeling a moment of gratitude of having this precious human life is really a good start. And then as a way to bring our focus more inward, because the best state of mind to be in order to either do a meditation, either a focused meditation, or what we would be doing later on in the teaching session would be more what is called an analytical meditation, being more receptive to some of the words of wisdom shared by the great masters, the Buddha and the great masters of the past. So as a way to make our mind and our situation most conducive for that, we'll just take a few moments to bring our focus and attention now to our breath. And now we'll just take a few moments where we, first of all, make a commitment to ourselves that as we all have dedicated at least an hour and a half, where we don't have to rush off anywhere, we don't have any meetings, hopefully our phones are muted, or at least we don't intend to answer the phone unless it's an emergency. So right now we really have this, again, perfect condition to be fully aware of the present moment. And within our present moment, we decide to just be fully aware of our breath, just simply that, the breath coming in through our nostrils and leaving naturally our nostrils. So let us all take a few moments to ourselves now, just being aware of our breath coming in, going out. Just simple as that. So by the virtue of just deciding to focus on our breath, and trying, our best to just be focused on that, what we notice is that the sort of mind starts to really settle down. The hyperactivity of the thoughts, at least we're not following those thoughts, even though they arise. So just in that, when the thoughts subside, our emotions in relation to the thought also naturally subside, and we get a natural sense of tranquility, and even perhaps kind of like a nice, peaceful feeling. So this is really a glimpse into the ultimate potential we have within ourselves to be naturally quiet and peaceful. And when we reach an actual state of natural quiet and peacefulness, it also comes along with a natural contentment, sense of satisfaction and contentment. So of course, we all know that while we're enjoying this temporary relaxed state of mind, relatively more peaceful, calm state of mind and tranquil mind, it wouldn't take much for all of the emotions, disturbing emotions, to come flooding back. Just if we suddenly have a memory or some sort of external condition like a sound or foul smell or something, or temperature changes suddenly, or a loud bang outside, suddenly all the habitual sort of emotions, disturbing emotions, will start to rise up again, right to the surface. So this is the reason why we really go further in finding out more techniques to deal with our mind, is to be able to deal with the situations as they rise in whatever circumstances we may find ourselves in. So, and of course, it is said that the ultimate goal in Buddhism through the practice of meditation and study and practice, other forms of practice, is to be able to really equip ourselves with being able to deal with whatever situation may arise. So here, let us then again show a bit of appreciation of having this opportunity, that we've made a decision to, of all possible things we could do on a Sunday morning, we have decided to spend this an hour and a half to gather together to share some of the Buddhist teachings, the wisdom, and through our mutual gathering and sharing, we can definitely gain some sort of insights. So as a way to really ensure that this becomes most meaningful time together, let us just set our intention, or what we call the motivation for this time together, that it may not be just oriented around just one's own personal happiness and peace, although that's where we start. May this time and energy spent together this morning be a way of a service to be able to really genuinely begin to understand others and to help others in whatever best way that is needed. And as we find and experience more and more tranquility and peace within ourselves, may we then be able to spontaneously and naturally share that with others. And the ultimate peace that is to be found within ourselves is when we become what is called enlightened, to become an actual Buddha ourselves. So may we then, if that is something which is possible, which is the topic of our discussions, then may I become a Buddha, may I become an enlightened being for the sole purpose of really benefiting others. So as our teachers have reminded us again and again, when we set our intention and like a goal or purpose of our gathering, of our time together in this way, right from the start, then that'll 100% guarantee our time together become most meaningful and most useful for good times that we have together, or even the challenging times. All of that will become purposeful and meaningful. So with that in our mind, we can slowly come out of our focused meditation by gradually again being aware of our physical presence. And then as we gradually open our eyes wider, we can be aware of our immediate surrounding. So it is wonderful indeed to have this opportunity to be able to connect with people around the world. It's really shown that there is no real barriers when it comes to really like-minded people getting together and wanting to share something. So I don't want to take maybe too much time of everyone trying to introduce themselves, and I guess can be, but I don't know if it would be safe to assume that many of you are maybe perhaps still quite new to Buddhism. I think that's the impression I get. So I'm very much a beginner myself in so many ways. So I mean, when I get an audience who I feel are quite new, then I feel very comfortable. I feel like I'm in a safe environment because, I feel like I can relate best to, on a simple level to people. And then if people, get inspired, then they can go further and meet greater teachers. So what I thought of doing first here is to actually read a passage from a book that I've got called The Stages of the Path to Enlightenment. In Tibetan it's called Lamrim. And this is a very a contemporary sort of commentary. And I found sometimes when I feel I just need to explain something, I just read from the text and it explains it the best. So this is like a brief introduction to this text, which I feel really serves a purpose for introduction to really the Buddhist teachings, large and great scopes of all the Buddhist teachings as well. So here as it reads, I'll just read this out. The path to enlightenment, or what we can call the Buddhist teachings, is about you. By studying it, you will learn about your present situation, how you have come to be here, and where you're heading in the future. You will discover the nature of life, the potential inherent in your mind, and how to actualize that potential to its fullest possible development, the attainment of enlightenment. We all need enlightenment, and the world that we live in cries out for it. In a sense, enlightenment is merely a change of perspective. That change to a new perspective is presented here in the teachings of the Enlightened One, Shakyamuni Buddha. So now I'll skip a few passages here, but come to again explaining slightly, or just really presenting what the Buddha is, or like what he was in the past. So the Buddha himself was once an ordinary person. He was not always enlightened. He experienced confusion, anxiety, fear, uncertainty, and pain. He was filled with doubt and unable to make decisions. I guess we can all relate to this as it's being listed here. He was stressed, on edge, and easily upset. It almost, of course, maybe in other traditions, this will be blasphemy, but this is how the Buddha himself said that he was ordinary, just like ourselves at one time. He was filled with doubt, unable to make decisions. He was stressed, on edge, and easily upset. He was lonely, unappreciated, and rejected. He was angry, hurtful, and full of hatred. He was selfish and miserly, jealous and proud. He felt like a failure and was immersed in depression. His hopes were dashed, his expectations frustrated, and life appeared to him to have no purpose or meaning. He was caught in the cycle of suffering at birth, sickness, old age, and death. And seeing that others were similarly afflicted, he sought out a solution. His solution is presented in his teachings, namely this teaching called the Path to Enlightenment. By integrating his mind with the concepts presented in these teachings, the Buddha attained enlightenment. He passed beyond all suffering and the negative attitudes that are the source of suffering. He removed even the subtlest limitations on a perfect view of the ultimate and conventional levels of reality, and thus enabled himself to become a source of happiness and benefit for all living beings. He achieved the perfection of peace, power, wisdom, and compassion, and the greatest expression of human potential, enlightenment. His attainment of enlightenment is the attainment that you will gain by integrating your mind with the perspective contained in this teaching. Use the path to enlightenment to stimulate your mind in directions that will enable you to discover the nature of mind, the real source of happiness and suffering that abide within it, and the means to develop your mind so that it becomes a true source of happiness for both yourself and others. So I guess that was quite clear, wasn't it? So I hope my accent is followable. Are you doing okay with my accent and my level of my voice and all of that? Okay, great. Also, I always like my classes, whether it's in person, and now this is first time I'm doing it completely on Zoom, is to be interactive. So that means that if any time you want to clarify something, of course we'll have time for questions, but if you want to clarify something or you want me to repeat something, just raise your hand and I will address that. So don't feel shy. But if I don't see any hands raised, now I'll just continue on speaking until we come to a point where we can all share. So is that clear to everyone? Hopefully it is. Okay, wonderful. So so before I actually introduce the text that we're going to do, I'd like to kind of share my version of one of the simplest ways to introduce Buddhism, introduce it in maybe 2 lines. And there's a classical way of doing that in the Buddhist context, which is Holiness Dalai Lama often uses as well. But I came across a saying, a quote from a very, very well-known, famous, I guess there's no one in the Western world who wouldn't know this name, an artist. And actually I was thinking, as I already planned to use this quote, and I see a beautiful drawing, painting behind someone there, James, I think it is. So I thought it was very appropriate. So the reason I like to use Western quotes when in an appropriate context, when it is appropriate, is because in the Western world, we what art is one of the, we could say art is a form of religion. People really follow art. They're fascinated about art and the artists. And then if they would the greater the art is, the painting is, the more fascinated people are with the painter, the life of that painter and the story about them. So without too much further going on about this, we all, I suppose there's no one who wouldn't know about Picasso, right? Pablo Picasso. So I came across a quote from him not too long ago, actually, from Picasso, partly where he had said, the meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it to others. And I found that fits so well in summarizing the Buddhist principle. So to paraphrase Picasso's words and into Buddhist context, we would say in Buddhism, the meaning of life is to find happiness within, for oneself. And the purpose of life is to make others happy. And these two lines, finding happiness within oneself, and when one is able then to share that with others, making others happy, is really what summarizes the whole range of what the Buddhist teachings really consists of. Traditionally, it is like commonly now the Buddhist traditions, although there are many facets within Buddhist tradition, the two main streams, as some of you may be already aware of, is what we call the Theravadan tradition, which is followed mostly in Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka, and some other countries. And then the Mahayana tradition, or the Great Vehicle tradition, which is the one which I belong to, that the teachings here are being presented from mainly from that source, and which is the Tibetan tradition, also in China, Japan, Korea, and many other Asian countries as well. So in a summary, the Theravadan tradition, for those who may not be too familiar with it, is really the main emphasis in the Theravadan traditions is to seek happiness for oneself, to find what is called liberation from this whole cycle of what was mentioned earlier, all the plights the Buddha himself experienced, frustrations, dissatisfaction, depression, all of that, to be free of all of that just for oneself. So seeking that goal merely for oneself. That is the primary focus. And that involves seeking happiness for oneself. At the very basic involves, as a practice, refraining from hurting others. If you go around hurting others, if you can't help others, the Dalai Lama often says, the very least is that for us to try to refrain from hurting others. So this practice of seeking self-liberation is based on the ethics of refraining from hurting other beings. And on top of this, there are three trainings. Training of morality, which is refraining from hurting other beings, training of concentration, meditation, and training of wisdom, which we will be introducing a bit here as well. The wisdom, particularly wisdom of realizing selflessness or emptiness. So these are the three main trainings in what we call the path leading to self-liberation. Now, the path, what we call the greater vehicle, which is the source of the teachings that we're going to be being introduced here this evening, is based on really seeking the means and ways, intentionally, purposefully seeking ways of how to bring happiness and relieve suffering for all other beings as well. And it is explained in our tradition that while liberation is definitely a possible goal, you are still limited, because while you are liberated and not suffering yourself, there's actually a technical term is becoming a foe destroyer, or that Sanskrit word, or maybe it's Pali word called arhat. I think it's a Sanskrit word, arhat. So that is what is translated in English as a foe destroyer, meaning destroying the foes of the inner demons, inner delusions. So when the inner afflictions are completely destroyed, then you reach a state of tranquility and peace. So that state in itself, however, is not a Buddha state. According to our tradition, one has not yet become a Buddha. one has reached a very significant level of reaching and feeling genuine peace and happiness within oneself. And of course, by the virtue of feeling great happiness and peace within oneself, there'd be no reason at all to hurt anyone else anymore. In fact, you've gotten rid of anger, you've gotten rid of all of these negative emotions. But what is left, though, according to our tradition, is there's subtle imprints of those delusions, which is still in the mind. And that which prevents that person, that being who's reached that state of liberation, what prevents them from being a Buddha is that subtle imprints, which are still in their mind. There are actually very good analogies, but I might as well mention it, even though it might come up later. Okay, the analogy of the what we call the afflictions themselves, the negative emotions or afflictions, there's many translations, so I'm going to be throwing around all of these different terms to just get an idea, but basically the primary ones are anger and jealousy and attachments or like desires, and then ignorance is the root. So the actual afflictions themselves, all of these are termed afflictions or delusions. They're like the analogy, which is I found very useful, very quick to understand, is having like a jar of garlic, a full jar of garlic. Now, if you wanted a clean container to store something of like milk or something like pure that you want to keep free from any other orders, first of all, if there's a jar filled with garlic, then you obviously would say, oh, well, that's not an empty jar. Even more so, even if you try to empty it right away, the stench is going to be very strong, right? So removing the delusions from the mind is like taking the garlic out of the jar and actually rinsing it maybe 1 or 2 times, where when you put it on the distance, it'll look very clean. And in fact, it is clean. There's no garlic anymore inside at all. But nevertheless, as soon as you open the top, there would be still the stench, the smell of the garlic. And that smell, we use the analogy of garlic because we all know that it can really permeate and remain for a long time. So the stench, the smell of the garlic would then put you off in wanting to put in like maybe a very clean substance in it, like milk or something else that you want to store, because you think, oh, it might still get that smell of garlic. So while there's no garlic in the jar at all, it still has a smell, like a stain of that smell. So that is the analogy of where a being who's removed all the afflictions from the mind is like a garlic jar freed from garlic, but still there's some stain there. There's like still a bit of a foul smell. That is like the imprints of the delusions. So that's why in our tradition it's said that in order to become a fully enlightened being, what we call in a Buddha, that very trace, that stains of the delusions have to be completely eradicated as well. So that's why we would hear again and again, as you become more interested and further pursue the Buddhist teachings, you would realize that although the path is very, very attractive, and in fact, who wouldn't want to become enlightened, but then it is a long path. There's no easy, quick way to reach enlightenment, but the process, is something which we can start at any time. And so now, the text which you might have already been introduced to are called 8 Verses of Training the Mind, is actually a text which deals in really working and overcoming the main obstacles to reaching those goals. So the 2 main obstacles to reach these 2 goals, to bring the whole range of Buddhist teachings into perspective, here again, we have the 2 main paths, the path leading to self-liberation and the path leading to becoming a whole enlightened being. The main obstacle to reach self-liberation is said to be this misconception of holding on to a truly existent self, an inherently existent self, like a concrete self. Self here can be referred to as a self-personal self, but it can also relate to all existence. Basically, the word self in this context is more like an identity. We hold on that misconception that we have of a truly concretely existing identity of ourselves and all other things is said to be the main obstacle to reaching that, what we call self-liberation state. Whilst the main obstacle to reaching the goal of enlightenment, because in order to reach the goal of enlightenment, a fully enlightened state, which we call the Buddha, the main thing that one has to develop is said an altruistic state of mind called, the technical word is bodhichitta. What that means is that a mind that aspires to enlightenment, but it has two aspirations. One aspiration is aspiring to reach enlightenment. The other aspiration is, which is both equally needed, that both aspirations are needed, is the aspiration to liberate and free all other beings from suffering. So in other words, aspiring to reach enlightenment or to become a Buddha so that one can free all other beings from all suffering. So this state of mind called awakened, the mind that aspires to enlightenment, the awakened mind, is actually based on developing unconditional love and compassion. It is based on that. So it's, and in the normal terms, in the worldly terms, we would think like, what more do you need if you've got unconditional love and compassion? What else do you need? What more do you need to help others? Well, in the Buddhist teachings, yes, one must develop love, unconditional love and compassion towards all, but that in itself is not sufficient to being able to fully help other beings. We need to develop, on top of that, based on unconditional love and compassion, one must also develop what is called the mind that aspires to achieve enlightenment so that one can actually help all other beings. Getting the full capacity to be able to help others. So that, so therefore, without developing this, without first of all developing unconditional love and then unconditional compassion, there's no way that one can develop the mind that wishes to aspire to enlightenment, because enlightenment, again, is not about oneself, right? If one thinks about enlightenment for oneself, one has already gone off the track. One may be actually going on this, you know, if one follows a path, a correct path, then one might lead to self-liberation, but not enlightenment, not the ultimate goal in Buddhism. So, so in order to develop that mind that aspires to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings, one has to develop unconditional love and compassion. And so the main obstacle, we could say, main hindrance, you know, what prevents us from developing unconditional love and compassion, and then based on that, the mind that aspires to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all beings. I'll use the word from now on, bodhichitta, which maybe many of you are already familiar with, but that's a term which summarizes, and in English is a mouthful, like the mind that aspires to achieve enlightenment for the sake of all sentient beings, whereas in the Sanskrit word is bodhichitta. So is that okay with you? I'll use the word bodhichitta, and if you can remember that what that actually means. Of course, we'll have to maybe further unravel it later on too. So this bodhichitta mind, which is a mind, the most altruistic mind that can be developed, which is based on developing love and compassion, the main hindrance, the main obstacle for developing that, all these three levels, unconditional love, unconditional compassion, and then the mind aspiring to achieve enlightenment, is said to be self-centeredness, a very strong sense of self-centeredness. So the stronger the sense, the stronger the focus is on me, just my own needs, the more unlikely one is able to develop love and compassion, unconditional love and compassion, and thus the mind aspiring to enlightenment to others. Now, this is where it starts becoming a little bit, you know, challenging here. We might have initially thought, oh yes, enlightenment, great, yeah, that's what I'm here for. I want to achieve enlightenment. But to overcome self-centeredness, now, of course, there are different levels of self-centeredness. So we will, you know, try to explore that. The very coarse, the most coarsest form, the most crude form of self-centeredness would be, even in a worldly sense, be acknowledged as being something really not really noble. You know, someone who has extreme self-centeredness would be called a selfish person. And we all don't want to be a selfish person. we don't want to be known as a selfish person. So in a worldly sense, you can live without being labeled a selfish person, but according to the Buddhist teachings, you might still have quite a strong sense of self. Actually, in a very subtle levels of that self-centeredness really comes from that misconception of the self. Misconception of where the self is, because it is based on the misconception of the self that one has a natural tendency to focus completely on oneself. Yeah. And this self-centeredness, again, there are translations which are used. Sometimes the translations can carry a bit of a misinterpretation just by the word itself, but many translators in the past have used to translate this particular Tibetan word of denoting that self-centeredness as self-cherishing. Now, the reason why the word self-cherishing can be misleading, and I remember the Dalai Lama correcting his interpreter once, his translator once, saying, "Oh, better maybe use the word self-centeredness, because self-cherishing, if it is presented as a vice, then people often think like, but then does that mean I don't have to care? I can't take care of myself anymore? Of course I cherish myself. How could I ever live without having to cherish myself?" So it can be misleading, but if one doesn't come across that word in the teachings, and if I do use it on occasion itself, it's got to be understood as that sort of like really a more extreme level of self-centeredness, which is called self-cherishing. Yeah. So self-cherishing is not to be understood here as like that one shouldn't care for oneself or one needs and so forth, but it's more like, again, when that term self-cherishing is used, it has a connotation of at the expense of others, at the expense of others' needs, and even if it causes harm to others, I'm still about, I don't care. I'm going to just fulfill my own needs, even if it's at the cost of others. So disregarding, it has that sense, the connotation of disregarding others' concerns, and the concern is primarily just focused on oneself. So even following the first path in Buddhism, what we can call the first, or that path leading to liberation, certain levels of self-centeredness definitely have to be overcome. Not on the subtlest level, though, because on the subtlest level, it is because of a little bit of a self-centeredness there, on the very subtlest level, that they're aiming just for one's own peace and happiness. Yeah. So all of this may seem a little bit technical right now, but it's all important to get to understand as a way to really introduce this text and the whole purpose of this text that we're covering. So all of that is maybe perhaps right now has been a little bit technical, but nevertheless, it's like a basis. So the main point, which maybe as a way to introduce the text and to go into it, is that if we can start to acknowledge that perhaps it may be true then that what is preventing us from developing an genuine altruistic sense of love and compassion to others is perhaps because there's still some strong self needs and some self-interest involved, and one is not yet capable of really going beyond that. So if it can start to acknowledge that to whatever degree and whatever level, then one might start feeling like, oh, is there a way that I can overcome this self-centeredness? And actually, according to the Buddhist, and even in our tradition, it is explained quite clearly in the teachings that actually, the more we focus on ourselves, the more we're absorbed on our own personal needs, actually becomes a basis for us to actually experience more turmoil, more problems for ourselves. Yeah. So here, the teachings are beginning to introduce a method and technique. So what actually, in pursuing the way and means to help others, becomes, as the Dalai Lama says, if we want to be selfish after all, we might as well be wisely selfish. So he's saying that actually, by getting rid of our self-centeredness, we actually are able then to fulfill our own best means of happiness and joy. So actually, it takes us a while for us to really sort of like begin to see that core relationship between, a self-absorbed and self-centered sort of state of mind and one's own unhappiness and sufferings. And it's not really so obvious right away. But from my limited experience in life so far, what I can share with you is that since about the last 3 or 4 years, nearly 4 years now, I started to have some obvious signs, actual symptoms of a bit of depression. And what I started to really notice more and more is that because of that pain and so forth, because of that pain and mental anguish and pain one is experiencing, of course, someone once asked me what is producing what, because what I did notice is that I become very, very self-absorbed. And the more I focus on myself, it seems that my agony seemed to even increase. And as at the later of this text will be presented a technique of how to shift your focus by shifting your focus on other beings, specifically a practice, very powerful practice called the practice of giving and taking others' sufferings upon yourself and giving your own happiness to others. So in the worst times, in the mornings where I felt like a pang in my chest and I couldn't even get myself out of bed and like dreaded to face the day, I just sort of, even just lying there in bed, I even trying to imagine others' sufferings and that how others are suffering much more than I am. And even just the thought that I could possibly maybe perhaps take their suffering, or that is actually their suffering is destroying my own self-centeredness, just kind of contemplating on it for a few moments, I tell you, really, it's like magic. It sort of relieved that heavy sort of tightness in my chest. And I felt that not even doing this practice systematically and formally, just even imagining to think of this practice seems to already relieve that sense of pain. For me, it was the first taste of how these techniques, when actually applied, seems to work. And what I found is that the reason why that sense of pang in my chest and feeling tightness and not being able to function, the reason why that was released was because I was focusing on other beings, or at least pretending to focus on other beings. Even just pretending to do this practice seems to have worked. Not let alone if someone can really practice it well, I'm sure. But just even shifting my focus just for a few moments on others, release that sense of pang and tightness within my chest. So for me, that was sort of like a taste of how, for me, it was, wow, okay. So it must be that when I'm most tight feeling and when I'm really feeling all of this, it must be coming from a self-absorbed mind, a self-centeredness. Anyway, this is my experience. I mean, again, I'm not going to relate this to the experience, and this is being true for all who are experiencing any sense of kind of depression and so forth, but I'm just relating my own personal experience and what helped in that moment. Because of course, as I'm sharing it now, I might as well say that I got with my firsthand experience of depression, I really started to get a glimpse of how people would go into try to do anything to numb themselves from the pain. People going into drugs or any kind of substance, alcohol, any kind of substance, if it's a form to numb the pain. If I wasn't a monk, I would have done it. Yeah. And of course, my doctors prescribed medication. Luckily, my clinical diagnosis was between mild to moderate depression, which meant that I was still able to function. It was just the mornings which was the hardest to get out of bed, which is hard enough anyway, but with depression, it was much harder. But once I got out of it and I started my morning practices, like my usual prayers and prostrations, I kind of like then, it was like a big weight being lifted off, and then I could continue during the day. So I told my doctor then that perhaps I will wait a bit longer to see if I can manage. And if it gets any worse, then I would have accepted the medication, because that's not against our rules. We can do medication. But of course, meanwhile, I was doing research and hearing more about medications. And apparently, if one does start the medication, then one would have to apparently be quite dependent on it, and then to stop it radically suddenly would also be quite dangerous too. So in other words, I really wanted to make sure, and of course I checked with my own teachers as well, meanwhile I've tried herbal medications and I went to therapy. So I'm just sharing all that because I know that depression it's just one word, but there's so many different ranges and so many different causes and so many different ways to be experienced it. But it has become undoubtedly one of the, we can say, a mental pandemic of the world. We're now fighting this virus pandemic of COVID, but that has caused even much more depression, I guess I've heard. So, it is something that it's good for us to really discuss and look into. So these teachings here, again, going back to the main point, is that these verses which are presented here are all ways of how to overcome that self-centeredness. Now, okay, as before going into the verses as a way to make sense, I've already mentioned earlier about the two main goals in Buddhism: self-liberation or becoming a Buddha, enlightened. So this is the teachings based on the methods for reaching enlightenment. So as mentioned earlier, without developing that altruistic mind, the most altruistic mind called bodhichitta, there is no way, there's no possibility for one has not even entered the path to leading to enlightenment. So that the interway, the gateway, we can say, of entering what we call Mahayana path, the great vehicle's path, which leads to enlightenment. Again, the path is just metaphorically used here. It doesn't relate to an external path. These are the paths which are described in the Buddhist teachings, are all different levels, states of mind. Yeah. So different states of mind we need to go through. So this path is internal path. The interway, the gateway to the Mahayana path, the great vehicle's path, is said to be bodhicitta. So without developing bodhicitta, there is no way we haven't even begun the actual first step on the path leading to enlightenment, the actual path. Before that, what we're doing, listening to teachings and trying to meditate, trying to do our practice, is all a preparation for that, for entering into the path. So bodhicitta, as mentioned earlier, bodhicitta is the altruistic mind that aspires to enlightenment in order to benefit all beings. Now, if that is the entry way, then how do we develop bodhicitta, one may ask? Well, there are two main techniques presented in the traditional Buddhist teachings. And these two techniques, the more common one in our tradition, in the Asian tradition, the more common one is what is called the 7 cause and effect technique. But then there's also, which was until certain, I wouldn't know the exact dates and the chronology of all of it, but there's another technique which is called the exchanging self with other technique of developing bodhicitta. So there's these two main techniques, the 7 cause and effect technique and the exchanging self with other technique. Now, actually, the Dalai Lama, he chooses to mostly use that exchanging self and other technique, especially in the Western context, because the 7 cause and effect technique will involve, of all things, the first step is the very first step, the 7 causes, I'll actually list them out now so that you would have an idea of it. So it's called the 7 cause and effect technique. Of these 7, the 7th one is the effect, which is the mind of bodhicitta. So the earlier 6 are the causes. Yeah. So within the 6 causes, there's one which goes even before that. So I'll list out the 6 causes. One is to recognize all beings as being like one's mother. The second cause, the second link, is after having recognized all beings as being as being like as equal to one's mother, then the second cause is to remember their kindness. And this is where, in the Western world, many people would struggle with. Because if you have to remember the kindness being of all beings as being your mother, it's hard enough to remember the kindness of one's own mother in this life. Yeah? And in fact, including myself, and this is one of my struggles, is to have a real loving connection and relationship with one's own mother in this life. Where if that is a struggle, then all the rest is going to be very difficult. Yeah. So that's why the Dalai Lama chooses, knowing the Western context, the Western psyche, which many people have the problem with that, recognizing the kindness of their own parents, and especially the mother or father. The Dalai Lama chooses to use the other technique more widely, which is exchanging self with other, which is based on seeing that just like one wants to be happy and does not want to experience suffering, any misery, likewise others do too, regardless of whether they're your father or have been your father or mother or not. Just seeing that we're all, first of all, equal in wanting to be happy, not wanting to experience any misery. And so why would I want to focus on my own happiness and wish to free myself from suffering when all others are also equally wishing that as well? Why would I work just for my own needs when others also have that wish? So that's the other technique. But as I promised to cover these 6 causes, so recognizing all beings as being your mother, the first one, so the second is remembering the kindness. Now, of course, in an Eastern context, of course, now things are changing as we, as the demographics and people are just look, but the traditional family nucleus in the Asian countries particularly, but also particularly in Tibet, was the mother was really the one who nurtured and cared for their children. And as the Dalai Lama often mentions in his teachings too, it is scientifically proven that when there's not enough nurturing and close connection between the parents, and particularly the mother and the child, that child has now been scientifically proven grows up to when there was some lack of affection from the mother, then they grow up to becoming a little bit, having a little bit sort of neurological sort of uncertainties, problems, depression, mistrust to others, and so forth. All of these things can arise when, from the very early childhood, as young as a tender baby, when that nourishing might have been lacked from either the mother or any caregivers. Yeah. So that's why, as we see that and this is, and of course it's a little bit of a generalization, but in a generalization, within that generalization, it is true to say that in the Eastern cultures, and particularly the Tibetan culture, the mother is known to be very loving and affectionate, and as far as always sleeping with the baby. I one Tibetan mother I knew of 3 children that I knew well when I was living in Australia. She was shocked when she gave birth to her youngest, which was a daughter. When she gave birth in the hospital the next day or the day after, I met her, and she said she was horrified that the first advice the nurses gave to her was, "You must not sleep with your child." In the Tibetan culture, that's unheard of. She said, "I slept with my 2 older children until they were 5 or 6 or 7." And whereas in the Western culture, you're being prepared to sleep in a cradle all by yourself right from the beginning. The preparation to put you in a separate crib and what of that, and even in a separate room is all prepared, right? Because the parents need their space, they need to sleep well. Of course, that doesn't mean they're completely neglected. There's monitors and they look after, but that lack of closeness, affection in the beginning, from the beginning childhood, is said to already cause that sense of alienation, lack of nurture from the mother. So that's why it can be a little difficult. It's good for us. And actually, I didn't bring the book here, but I'll maybe show you the cover of the book. But a very good book to really go through and understand this is written by a Western Buddhist called Rob Kreese, and he was an old student from early days of the Tibetan tradition, and he explains this very precisely about why it is difficult for us to feel that natural feeling of affection towards the mother for many is because of that basic of these reasons. And his book is called The Courage to The Courage to Feel. That's a book. I'll show the cover of the book maybe in our next session, because I don't want to disrupt this session now. But it's a I really highly recommend that book. It goes through these 7 cause and effects, and then really precisely discusses why we might find that difficult. So, however, we're still on the second cause, which is remembering the kindness. If one can remember the kindness, then the third cause will naturally follow, which is wishing to repay that kindness. And if we leave the scene of the mother outside right now away for a moment, even with an ordinary person, anyone, if we do remember whenever someone has been kind to us and we can truly feel their kindness, first of all, sometimes we take things for granted, speaking for myself, and we often forget the kindness others have shown to us. But at moments when we are reminded, for whatever reason, the kindness of others, we naturally then want to feel, oh, they have been really kind to me. How could I repay their kindness? What could I do in return? And no one has to ask us of that. That is a natural inborn feeling we have, isn't it? The wish to repay someone's kindness. And so that's why that is the third cause. Remembering the kindness. The mother is used as the classic example in the Eastern tradition, but if we were to leave the mother aside for now, we could use any example here of someone who's been kind to us. If we remember their kindness is the first step. Wishing to repay their kindness. Remembering. Well, of course, traditionally the first cause here is called remembering all as being one's mother. But we can say remembering all have been kind to us. If we can remember all have been kind to us, then wishing to repay that. Remembering the kindness comes a second, and then the third is wishing to repay the kindness. Then comes love. When you will naturally feel affection. This love here is a natural affection towards others, seeing the beauty of others, and naturally being drawn to others. And this love here, of course, is a very specifically defined love. In the Buddhist context, it's good to know the definitions of these terms. So in the Buddhist context, in the Buddhist scriptures context, love is a sentiment where when one truly wishes others to be happy, to be genuinely happy, that is called love. That is called love. So so when one genuinely wishes others to be happy without wanting anything in return, really, this time they've been kind to you already in the past. So from now, it's from my side. I want them to be really, truly happy. And that, when one feels that unconditionally towards others, that is called love, genuine love, unconditional love. What in the Buddhist terms is called great love. When that focus then is onto all beings, then it is great love. That would be followed by compassion, great compassion, or unconditional compassion. And then the definition of compassion is, so it's kind of like two sides of the same coin, love and compassion. It's two different terms, but it's very specific in the Buddhist teachings because it's specific sentiments. So while love was wishing others to be happy, genuinely happy, compassion is the wish for genuinely wishing others to be free of all misery, all unhappiness, all suffering. Wishing others to be free of suffering. That is called compassion. So in the 7 cause and effect sequence, when you have actually developed great love and compassion, truly wishing others to be happy and free of all misery, then the natural question which will come to oneself is, so that we're still on the fifth cause. Now the 6th cause, it's right before the effect, is said to be what is it called? It is called, in English, the translation is Haksam, Tibetan. And in English, the superior intention, which is that wishing others to be happy, love, and wishing others to be free of all misery or suffering, which is compassion, is great as far as an attitude or sentiment is concerned. It is one of the greatest sentiments you could have towards others. But the question will arise that, well, if I don't do anything about it, it's just a nice wish, but you haven't done anything about it. You haven't really done anything to really, make others happy or relieve them from their suffering. So that's why the sixth cause, just before the actual altruistic mind of bodhicitta, the sixth and final cause is said to be the superior intention, which is this intention where I will take responsibility to make others happy and relieve them from all suffering and misery. I would actually personally take that responsibility myself. So when one actually makes that decision of taking that responsibility upon oneself to make others happy, so we can take this, of course, in a more immediate situation. A parent naturally takes a responsibility for their children. Every good parent will have that, a natural inclination of taking the responsibility to make sure their children are happy and that they're not suffering in any way, to the best of their ability, right? So here we're talking on a larger scale, really, extending that to all beings. So when one takes that personal responsibility of really determining oneself to free all beings from all misery and leading them to all happiness, then one has developed that superior intention. So while one has developed that superior intention, which is sixth cause, it has not yet become bodhicitta yet. Why? Because first of all, one will start to question oneself. Although I really truly wish others to be happy and be free of suffering, all misery, how can I possibly do that when I'm still suffering myself? And how could I possibly do that when I don't have the means to do that? I don't have the wisdom or the skill to be able to do that. And that's when it is said that one will be aspired, if one comes into contact with the Buddhist teachings, one will begin to hear the qualities of a Buddha, the enlightened being, in which it is said that when you become an enlightened being, that's when you will have the full potential, the full capacity, the full ability. Not will we only be free of all misery and suffering ourselves and be truly happy ourselves. That package of enlightenment will come with the full potential, the full ability to be able to help others. So that is then when one has developed that aspiration to achieve enlightenment so that one can free all beings from suffering and lead them to ultimate happiness, that is called bodhicitta. So this text here will be using both techniques, alternating between both techniques of the seven cause and effect technique plus the technique of exchanging self with others. So that's exchanging self with other, again, to explain that simply before we go into the text, as the Dalai Lama very, very simply puts it, he puts it very neatly. He says, if we were to imagine two groups of two groups, okay? On one group, you've got all other humanity, all living beings, all humanity and all other forms of living beings on one group. On the other side, this is just an imagination. This is like just, like playing with our minds to give a sense of what we're coming at. Another group here, we've got oneself. Yeah, yourself here, and then all other beings on the other side, on this side. So if one were to imagine that actually one is a separate, just for the sake of this illustration, one is temporarily imagining that one is a separate entity here on the side, and then you're being given here two scenarios. One, all beings, and the other side, or it can be actually even just one person, or in all other beings. So as the Dharma says, if one were given a choice to join these two groups, what would one naturally be inclined to join? Just this one person? And if it is this one person is just oneself, then that means, by the way, joining this group of just oneself would mean that you have no connection, no relation with all the other beings. You're completely on your own. You'll have to fend for yourself, get your own means. Of course, you have to plant your own food and get all the resources just by yourself. And there's nothing, not relying on anyone else. So is that even possible? But if it were possible, would we still want to choose to just go on the side of just one person and completely alienate ourselves completely from the rest. Yeah. Although sometimes, if one is a little bit of an introvert, which I tend to be sometimes too, I did a test once, and I think it's somewhere between. Not a complete extrovert, not a complete introvert, somewhere in between. That fits me right. But if one were to be a complete introvert, it might be quite attractive. Oh, I just want to go be by myself. But here we're talking about this case of where you're completely alienating yourself from all others. I think no matter who they are, who one may be, as introvert as one may be, with some common sense, one would realize that without others, one couldn't possibly even survive. Yeah. So what the Dalai Lama is saying in this analogy, in presenting this analogy, is that so thus, if we want to be part of the larger group, then that means we're working for the happiness of all, not just oneself, because one is not focusing on just one's own happiness. One might as well then start working for the well-being and happiness that will help the rest, everyone together. Because when everyone's happy, we all know this in a family, if everyone's happy in the family, even if it's temporary at the dinner table, when everyone's just, has no issues raising and all of that, we have a nice meal together. When everyone's happy, then we are happy. But if some turmoil, something goes on in the dinner table, then it can disturb everyone, right? So these are just some practical ways of looking at it. And so this, so here, the main theme of the teaching and the presentation here is by really beginning to see that actually one's own happiness is very much dependent on others, on relying on others. And again, here I will failing time to go into greater detail of how the teachings explain that actually, not only our temporary happiness, like our food and clothing and all our needs are dependent on others, but even our ultimate goals of enlightenment is dependent on others. Because as mentioned earlier, without developing bodhicitta, without developing the altruistic wish to benefit others, we can't even reach our own goal of enlightenment, even for our own sake. If it was to be for our own sake, we can't even reach that. So in fact, all the virtues in the teachings that are required, that are the practices that are required to reach enlightenment. So after developing that bodhicitta, that's a state of mind. What is the actual practical practice one needs to do when that state of mind has been developed? In summary, there's 6 practices. We start by being generous to others, practice of generosity. And then the second is practice of moral ethics. Ethics here means really the intention not to harm others, refraining from harming others, that's ethics. Generosity, ethics. And the third is very crucial practice, which is patience. So without patience, one can possibly help others. Then the fourth, Jimba Tsuten Soba. Tsundu is what is translated as joyous effort. We need to practice joyous effort in being able to joyously engage in the practice of meditation, for example, studies, and whatever we need to do in order to advance ourselves, doing it with a joyous mind, joyous effort. It does require some enthusiasm, some effort, but with a joyous mind. So that is the fifth, Jinba Tsuten Soba Tsundu. That is the fourth. Then the concentration and wisdom. So is that only 5 then? How am I missing one? Jimba Tsuden Soba Tsundu Samden Shira. Oh yeah, there we go. So generosity, ethics, patience, joyous effort, concentration or meditation, and wisdom. These are the 6 practices. The 6 practices which are required. So how do we engage in the 6 practices? By relying on others. We cannot be generous without others. We cannot practice ethics or refraining on harming others if there's no others there, right? So we develop our ethics by relying on others and our patience, particularly patience with others. And this is how we develop our practices to reach our goals, ultimate goals. So these practices here are ways of how to do that, and seeing it begins with really recognizing that others are very precious. Other beings are really precious, because it is in relation to others that one can engage in all of these practices. So therefore, if I introduce now the first verse, which is with a determination, does people have, are you available? But anyway, if I read it out, it's not, just one. So my idea is that in the 4 sessions that we have, at least if I can try to cover 2 verses at a time, then we might be able to finish the text. So the first verse here is with the, sorry, yes.
Would you like me to share the first 2 verses?
Yes, please.
Okay. I'll start.
Okay. So as it reads here, with a determination to accomplish the highest welfare of all sentient beings, who excel even the wish-granting Jew, may at all times hold them dear. So the first verse is about really, on basis of really beginning to recognize that other beings are really precious, actually precious, more precious than even a wish-granting Jew, which means that, again, here, the method, there's this sort of methodological sort of jewel that is used as an example or an illustration, that if there was such a jewel called a wish-granting jewel, that means that all your wishes, but the wishes here are actually all worldly wishes, temporary wishes, to release us from our, poverty and so forth. But the beings, sentient beings, no matter how precious and how valuable a jewel may be, it can definitely not bring you enlightenment. It cannot bring you all the virtues leading up to enlightenment. Having, you cannot, the jewel itself cannot teach us how to be more patient, practice more generosity, be ethical, and so forth. So it is, again, that is why it is explained here that sentient beings, living beings, actual other beings, humans and otherwise other beings, are all very precious, more precious than this precious jewel, because we can gain so much. We can gain so many. We can develop ourselves to the greatest extent to even becoming a Buddha in relation to sentient beings. So that's why, by recognizing beings as being more precious than wish-granting jewel, and the determination to accomplish the highest welfare, which means wishing to achieve enlightenment for that, for the sake of all sentient beings, who actually are more precious than the wish-fulfilling jewel, may I at all times hold them dear. So this is as a way to develop our love and compassion, unconditional love and compassion. We begin by wanting to hold them dear, hold them close. Yeah. So all of these verses, as we go through them, will start to progressively lead us onto more and more challenging practices, by the way. I just have to warn you from the beginning. But nevertheless, the first verse here is something maybe we might be quite comfortable with. Now, the second verse is already beginning to get a little bit challenging for ourselves, which is whenever I associate with others who have decided to hold them dear, which are dear to me, are more precious than a wish-granting jewel. Whenever I associate with others, may I think myself as lowest of all, and from the depth of my heart, hold others supreme. So this second verse is particularly a verse in which is a way to overcome our sense of self-importance or pride. It is whenever we see others as being less than ourselves, it is because of the sense of pride we have, that we are better in some way than others, that gives us that sense of holding others, the view or the perception that others are less important than oneself, others are lower than ourselves. So if one can, to counteract that sense of pride, this verse is particularly a verse where one voluntarily takes upon oneself the attitude of holding others above oneself and seeing oneself. Here again, this can be very easily misinterpreted if one does not understand it in its proper context. Of course, it's not suggesting that we are nothing, we should be like a doormat, and that everyone can step over us because we're the lowest No, it's more from an attitude from our mind, where we hold others more superior than ourselves, have respect, genuine respect for others. The Dalai Lama himself is a perfect example. When you see the Dalai Lama in a crowd, before he sits up on the throne to give the teaching, he always bends down and bows down to everyone. That is his genuine sort of, how we can say, humility, or genuine sense of modesty, of really respecting others. But then for the purpose of for the purpose of then presenting the teaching and so forth, he has to sit up a little bit higher. He has to sit on the throne. But in that instance, it's not as if he's holding himself more important than others. He does hold all others as being more, very, with great respect. But again, for certain purposes, like if you're a boss of a company, of course you have to be sitting, and instructing others what to do. But therefore it's more like a mental attitude which we're training ourselves in. Internally, we show respect to others, but for certain cases, we might have to be a sort of like in a leader role. So I hope this makes a bit of sense, all of these two versions. So I'll just leave it now to just a few minutes we have left to questions. Sorry, I didn't realize that it was going to, but being the first evening and having to introduce all of this, I kind of felt like it might take a bit more time. And I promise you we'll leave more times for questions later. But if there's any questions at this point, I'm really happy to address those questions, or if you want me to clarify something, please unmute yourself. Did you feel that it made some sense? It can be even just like a sharing of how you felt. Did it make sense, what was presented? Did it seem too far-fetched, maybe? No, okay. Yes. I mean, when the teachings are presented in its most practical ways, it's hard to disagree with it. What we do find hard is to actually practice it, and I'm speaking for myself. But then when it comes to certain points, we will still find it a little bit challenging, especially when it comes to the later verses. We'll find it challenging, but again, we'll try to understand it in its proper context. It usually, for me at least, I've come to understand that it can be either challenging when one has really not understood its proper context, or it can be actually challenging because I don't really feel ready yet right now. And that's fair enough. I mean, we're all humans and we're all beginners in our own way. So there can be certain practices which sound wonderful, which are great, but I don't feel quite ready for that. But nevertheless, why not consider it, or why not hear about it, a possibility of it? So I'm again taking time away from possible questions. So please unmute yourself if you do have a question.
Venerable.
Yes.
We have a comment from Stephen
Sure.
in the chat. And
Sure.
Stephen says, I appreciate the fact you brought your own struggles into the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yes. I feel that's something I need to be careful that I'm not loading my stuff on others, but I feel when it's relevant and when it comes in context, I feel more than ready to share my own experiences, because I feel it is only really in sharing that we can all together realize that we all have similar struggles and we all need to support each other. So it is in that context. So I'm thank you. I appreciate it.
Also a comment from Doris stating yes, very clear. And just now, I did too, to a response to your last few sentences. Thank you. That was from Doris as well. Venerable, I have a query.
Sure.
And we're talking about, giving compassion and wishing happiness for others and love. In some instances, I suppose it's where it's more overt, to might say perceived enemies. And it seems, that can be kind of taken advantage of. You can seem stupid and simple and a pushover. And I think I've been in that situation, quite a lot of my life, but also I've been in situations where I have had to be wrathful to protect myself and to protect, others, be it verbally or, physically moving myself away or pushing other people away from me, in certain
Yes.
relationships. So I don't know, is that still a right way to behave, or
Mhm.
I'm just confused. I'm just
Well,
confused.
of course, these practices, of course, I should have maybe mentioned right from the beginning, are actually, to actually put them into practice requires, is a very high level, high standard of practice. So it is based on many preliminary practices one have done, that these teachings are then presented as a way to embrace and put them into practice actually. So one may wonder, like, why are we presenting these teachings now then? Well, it is like a roadmap, since we are, as mentioned earlier, since we are interested in wanting to reach the ultimate potential that we can develop, if that's enlightenment we would like to, then it might, at least, why not be presented with what a roadmap is, like sort of basically a roadmap. It's like if we want to climb Mount Everest, if we are tempted and we want to we would like to know details about, well, what does it involve? We know how long does it take, and what are the pitfalls, and so we prepare ourselves as best as we can. So these teachings are not suggesting that as soon as we hear them and that there's something that we can put into practice right away. That's one aspect of it. But on a practical level, the teachings are not suggesting that we be a victim and that we allow others. And it is not suggesting that when, for example, of course, in your question, what also comes out clearly is whether perhaps that practice of forgiveness is really is it a possible practice? Is it required? Can one forgive one's enemies if they've been so cruel to us, or if forgiving means that we're allowing them to continuously take advantage of that? Is that something that is it advisable? Is it acceptable? Is it advisable? I think that is where the question is really ringing to. So here, of course, the teachings itself are saying that the main thing to protect our mind is to protect our mind, because ultimately, yes, we have physical pain, but from our own experience again, the psychological pain is much more deeper, much more harder. So what the teachings are saying, that if we can begin to recognize that these feelings, these emotions of resentment and anger is actually a very deep psychological pain that we're causing ourselves, then it is not, then if we can begin to make that connection, then it is not about saying that, oh, what the others have done is okay, or forgive them because what they did is fine, or whatever. It's not about that. It's more about protecting one's own mind, one's own. Externally, one may still have to use means and ways to protect oneself if it requires some sort of. Oh, I think the guest is just about to come in. Available Rubina coming this evening. I think they're just here. So, so that is so. In other words, we are we're protecting our own mind. That is the main point. Yeah. And so I guess I actually have noticed that we are coming to the end of our session anyway. So that's the thing, we have timed it to come in as well. That's fine. So please come in, please do come in. I don't think you'll disturb anyone. People might be very happy to see you.
Hello, darlings. Hello.
Hello, Venerable.
Happy to see you all. Good. See you later. I'll leave you in peace.
Is Amanda coming in? Please come in. So we'll address that further in our maybe next sessions. This is going to be a topic which will come up again and again, I'm sure. Yeah. So maybe we can just take a few moments for this evening at least, to just really set that down, feel that just what we have discussed this evening, what we've shared, the time and energy we've spent together has been all really worthwhile, based on our good intention from the beginning. So we can just rejoice in the fact that we have had this opportunity for ourselves and for others. And we dedicate it, meaning that we really dedicate all our energy and positive time together this evening for the highest possible goal, which is enlightenment. So I hope that was not too rushed to the end, but was that okay for the evening? We have come to our time. Is that good?
That was awesome.
Yeah, okay. And so if you're all intending to come next week, we'll continue our discussions for our next week. Is that good?
Perfect. Thank you, Venerable
Thank you,
Michael.
Venerable
Thank you
Michael.
so much.
Thank you,
Venerable.
everybody.
Have a wonderful
See you
good
next
night.